On December 18, 1888, Richard Wetherill, his brother-in-law Charles Mason, and a Ute guide named Akowitz were riding across southwestern Colorado looking for lost cattle. Snow covered parts of Mesa Verde. The job was ordinary: find the animals, bring them back, get home. Then, near what is now called Sun Point, they looked across Cliff Canyon and saw something that changed American archaeology. Beneath a gigantic sandstone overhang, almost perfectly hidden from the mesa above, stood an entire stone settlement. Walls rose from the shadow. Doorways opened into rooms that had been empty for centuries. Circular ceremonial chambers filled the floor. Wetherill and Mason went down to investigate. That same afternoon, Wetherill entered another abandoned settlement, now called Spruce Tree House. The following day, the men reached Square Tower House. These places were not unknown landscapes awaiting Europeans. Pueblo descendants maintained ancestral connections to the region, and Ute people knew the country intimately. But for the newcomers, staring into that canyon in 1888, the scale of what they were seeing was astonishing. Cliff Palace alone contains roughly 150 rooms and 23 kivas, and today it is considered the largest cliff dwelling in North America. The strangest part was not that somebody had built it. The strangest part was when they built it. The ancestors of today's Pueblo peoples had lived around Mesa Verde for more than 700 years, beginning around 600 CE. For most of that time, they lived on the mesa tops, farming corn, beans, and squash in open communities under the sky. Then, during roughly the final century of occupation, many families began constructing elaborate villages inside sandstone alcoves below the rim. And before 1300, those villages were empty. No written chronicle tells us exactly why the move into the cliffs happened, what every unusual building meant, who threatened whom, or why thousands of people eventually migrated away from the northern San Juan region. Archaeology has answered enormous questions here. It has also exposed harder ones. Mesa Verde National Park covers more than 50,000 acres of high plateau, canyon, pinon, juniper, and sandstone in southwestern Colorado. Nearly 5,000 archaeological sites have been recorded inside the park, including at least 600 cliff dwellings. The communities preserved there are ancestral places connected to living Pueblo peoples, including Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and Rio Grande Pueblo communities. That matters because the people of Mesa Verde did not vanish. Their descendants live in the southwest today. What vanished was a particular landscape of settlement. By the late 13th century, one of the most densely studied cultural regions in North America was being emptied. Quick second before we go deeper. If this kind of investigation is why you came here, subscribe. It costs you one click, and it helps me keep doing the research behind stories like this. Now back to Mesa Verde, because the closer you look at these buildings, the less simple the story becomes. The first mystery. The cliffs were a sudden choice. For roughly 6 centuries, families at Mesa Verde built homes mainly on the mesa tops. Then, during the 1200s, construction shifted dramatically into sheltered alcoves in the canyon walls. Modern visitors experience those alcoves as breathtaking architecture. Imagine living there instead. You descend steep hand and toe trails carrying water, corn, firewood, children, pottery, stone tools, and construction material. Your fields are still mostly above you. Your daily work has not magically moved into the canyon. Yet families invested extraordinary labor in building below the rim. The National Park Service emphasizes that cliff dwellings represent only the final 75 to 100 years of Mesa Verde's long occupation. That means this famous way of life was not normal for most of Mesa Verde history. It arrived near the end. Archaeologists recognize the scale of that transformation by comparing hundreds of excavated structures, settlement locations, pottery sequences, and tree ring dates. The reason remains complicated. Alcoves offered shelter from weather. Many contained or stood near seep springs. Some locations were easier to defend. Communities were also becoming more concentrated during a period of social and environmental stress. But no single explanation covers every cliff dwelling. The Park Service itself warns against treating them simply as fortresses. Many were homes, storage spaces, communal places, and ceremonial landscapes. Scientists can describe the change in extraordinary detail, but they cannot point to one document saying, "This is why we moved." 600 years on top, then generations below the rim. Why did a whole settlement pattern change so close to the end? The second mystery. Cliff Palace was more than housing. When Wetherill and Mason looked across the canyon in 1888, they were staring at something far larger than the ordinary cliff residence. Cliff Palace contains about 150 rooms and 23 kivas, and probably housed around 100 people. Most cliff dwellings in the park are tiny by comparison. Roughly 3/4 contain only 1 to 5 rooms, and many are simply storage structures. Cliff Palace is an outlier, hiding in plain sight. When Smithsonian archaeologist Jesse Walter Fuchs formerly worked at Cliff Palace in the early 20th century, he was already dealing with a damaged record. Earlier collectors and visitors had removed artifacts, and later preservation required repairing unstable walls. That loss matters because function is reconstructed from context. Remove the objects, and you erase part of the explanation. Archaeologists noticed another anomaly. Cliff Palace has roughly 1 kiva for every 3 rooms, while many villages have closer to 1 for every 6. That unusually high concentration suggests Cliff Palace may have served people beyond the families sleeping there. Perhaps gatherings, ceremonies, exchange, or political activity brought neighbors into the alcove. The Park Service describes it as potentially becoming a public center because of its scale. But there is no surviving title for the building, no council record, no written account of who controlled the space. Palace is a modern name. What was this enormous hidden community actually for? The third mystery. Spruce Tree House preserved its own ceiling. On the afternoon of December 18th, 1888, after seeing Cliff Palace, Richard Wetherill entered another major dwelling. 20 years later, in 1908, Jesse Walter Fuchs removed collapsed debris and stabilized what became known as Spruce Tree House. What emerged was one of the most intact ancestral settlements in the park. About 90% of the material visible today is original. Walls, plaster, timber, even portions of roofs survived beneath the sandstone shelter for more than 7 centuries. The village contains about 130 rooms and 8 kivas, and may have housed 60 to 80 people. Tree ring evidence places construction between 1211 and 1278. Now imagine standing there in the late 1270s. Smoke darkens the alcove ceiling. Corn is stored behind masonry walls. Water comes from the spring. Families sleep beneath wooden roofs whose beams will still exist hundreds of years later. Then the people leave. The building does not burn to the ground. It is not systematically dismantled. Enough remains that archaeologists can trace gradual construction over decades. Yet the final decision to depart is preserved only indirectly. Even the alcove itself remains dangerous today. A near-miss rockfall in 2015 led the Park Service to close Spruce Tree House because the arch above it has been unstable for more than a century. The village survived human absence better than modern engineers can guarantee the cliff will survive gravity. The walls remain, the roofs remain, the people moved on. What finally outweighed the value of a place built to endure? The fourth mystery. Square Tower House rises 4 stories. On December 19, 1888, Wetherill and Mason climbed into another alcove and encountered what we now call Square Tower House. The surviving tower reaches about 27 feet and 4 stories, the tallest standing ancestral structure in Mesa Verde National Park. Around it are original roof beams, plastered walls, painted surfaces, rock art, and an unusually intact kiva roof. Roughly 90% of the visible fabric is original. When archaeologists excavated and stabilized the site in the early 20th century, they were not looking at a crude refuge thrown together during panic. They were looking at deliberate engineering. Stone had to be selected, shaped, hauled, mortared, plastered, and integrated into a confined ledge beneath tons of sandstone. Today, reaching the site requires a steep descent, ladders, scrambling over boulders, and crossing a narrow cliff ledge. For the original residents, this was home. But the tower still resists a simple explanation. Towers across the Mesa Verde region have been interpreted in different ways: observation, storage, ceremonial use, signaling, defense, or combinations of functions. Square Tower House preserves architecture better than it preserves intention. 4 stories are still standing right now, and nobody can ask the builders why that vertical space mattered. The fifth mystery. Sun Temple may never have opened. In 1915, Jesse Walter Fuchs began excavating a mound on the mesa directly across from Cliff Palace. Before excavation, trees and brush covered the location, and no towering walls announced what lay underneath. As the rubble came away, an enormous D-shaped masonry complex emerged. The walls were double-coursed, packed with rubble, and constructed from carefully shaped stones. Based on the amount of fallen masonry, the original walls may have risen between 11 and 14 feet. And then the absence became the evidence. Archaeologists found no normal household assemblage, no roof beams, no signs that ordinary families had moved in and lived there. Modern Pueblo consultants identify the architecture as ceremonial, but the precise use remains unresolved. One possibility is deeply haunting because it fits what is missing. Sun Temple may have been unfinished. Imagine the labor already invested, walls carefully planned, stones shaped one by one, a massive building rising across the canyon from Cliff Palace. Then construction stops before roofing and occupation. Later researchers have tested possible solar and lunar alignments, and some studies argue that celestial observation influenced the design. But the exact function still cannot be demonstrated with certainty. Even the stone basin near the southwest corner may have marked seasonal sunlight, but the Park Service describes that as a possibility, not a settled fact. The building stands there today like a sentence cut off halfway through. What happened while it was being built? The sixth mystery. Step House hides 5 centuries underground. In 1891, Swedish researcher Gustaf Nordenskjöld entered Step House with members of the Wetherill family. He documented artifacts from the alcove, but he did not realize that another settlement lay underneath. 35 years later, in 1926, Park Superintendent and archaeologist Jesse L. Nussbaum returned with a crew. They cut through a layer of refuse between 2 and 6 feet deep, broken pottery, animal bone, and debris deposited by 13th century residents. Beneath it, they hit the remains of much older pit houses. The discovery exposed 2 completely different occupations in the same alcove. The older pit houses date to roughly the 600s or 700s. The later masonry village dates to around 1200 and contains 27 rooms and 3 kivas. About 5 centuries separate those building traditions. The later residents apparently knew older structures were beneath or around them. Some ancient spaces were left untouched, while newer construction spread across the alcove. Then, in 1962, Robert Nichols and Al Lancaster uncovered 3 additional pit houses, including 2 buried beneath the later Pueblo masonry. This is archaeology stacked vertically. One community living above the physical traces of ancestors from half a millennium earlier. Yet we cannot recover exactly what those later families understood about the buried homes. Were they remembered places, sacred places, simply old ruins beneath the floor? No inscription tells us. The deeper archaeologists dug, the longer the memory of the alcove became. The 7th mystery. Longhouse had a public heart. Between 1959 and 1961, teams working through the Wetherill Mesa Archaeological Project excavated and stabilized Longhouse, one of 15 sites investigated in the project from 1958 to 1963. As debris came away, the scale became obvious. Longhouse stretches nearly 300 feet from end to end, contains roughly 150 rooms and 21 kivas, and may have housed 150 to 175 people. An active spring emerges in the alcove. Basins and drainage features run along the rear. This was not an accidental refuge. It was a carefully organized settlement, wrapped around water. Then archaeologists reached the central plaza. It was larger and more formal than expected. Benches, vaults, and a raised firebox suggested that this space may have functioned like a dance plaza or great kiva, a setting where people from beyond the immediate village gathered. That possibility changes the emotional geometry of Longhouse. Instead of families hiding separately in cliffs, you have crowds potentially coming together inside the canyon, trading, performing ceremonies, renewing relationships, sharing news. Yet no one can reconstruct the exact events. The architecture indicates public use, but the calendar is gone. No list of ceremonies survives. No official record tells us who arrived, who spoke, or what was decided. You can still stand near the spring that helped sustain them. The water continues. The public life it supported does not. What kind of community center was operating inside that stone alcove during Mesa Verde's final decades? The 8th mystery. The landscape was drying beneath them. The first people to recognize the climate story were not looking for weapons or skeletons. They were reading wood. Tree ring archaeology transformed the chronology of the Southwest because every preserved beam could contain a sequence of good years and bad years. Across the northern Southwest, those rings document major drought episodes, including severe dryness from roughly 1130 to 1180, and another critical drought beginning in 1276 and continuing into the final decades of regional depopulation. Construction patterns, farming potential, population shifts, and migration can now be placed beside those climate records year by year. But drought does not solve the case. People in the Southwest had survived drought before. They moved fields, stored corn, adjusted settlement, exchanged resources, and relied on social networks. The cliff dwellings themselves were built during a period when communities were capable of complex cooperation. Scientists therefore treat the end of Mesa Verde as a compound process. Declining rainfall, agricultural pressure, population concentration, social instability, migration, and violence interacting rather than one climatic switch suddenly turning civilization off. That is the baffling part. The environment clearly matters, it just does not act alone. Put the timelines side by side. Defensive settlement intensifies in the 13th century. Serious drought begins in 1276. Regional violence is documented near 1280. Permanent migration accelerates. The dates overlap. But archaeology still cannot reduce those overlapping pressures to one final trigger. What happens when environmental stress does not destroy a society directly, but begins tightening every other pressure around it? The ninth mystery. The violence was real. This is where we have to leave the boundaries of Mesa Verde National Park and look at the wider Mesa Verde region, because this is where the strongest physical evidence appears. At Castle Rock Pueblo in southwestern Colorado, Crow Canyon archaeologists uncovered human remains lying on floors, in collapsed roofing material, and on the butte itself. They were not formal burials. Bioarchaeological analysis identified skull fractures and other injuries occurring at or near the time of death. At least 41 people out of a community estimated between 75 and 150 were killed in an attack sometime after 1274, probably in the early to middle 1280s. Men, women, and children died. Some remains showed earlier healed injuries, meaning this may not have been the community's first encounter with violence. Portions of kiva roofs were deliberately burned during or shortly after the attack. And here, the professionals reach a wall. Who attacked Castle Rock? The evidence does not provide a name. Kristin Kuckelman's archaeological assessment considered possible outsiders, but the record contains too little evidence for a large invading population capable of forcing thousands of Pueblo people out of the region. She concluded that attackers may more likely have come from within the Pueblo world itself, perhaps amid competition for food or water. But even that remains an interpretation rather than a recovered confession. Sand Canyon Pueblo preserves evidence of at least 8 violent deaths around 1280 as well. This does not prove that every cliff dwelling was built because families feared attack. It does prove that fear of violence in the late Mesa Verde region was not imaginary. No army name, no written war, no treaty, no surviving victor's account. Just broken bone, burned roofing, defensive architecture, and abandoned settlements. Tell me in the comments, if you lived a few miles away and news of Castle Rock reached your village, would you stay on an exposed mesa top? The 10th mystery. They left the cliffs behind. Archaeologists did not discover this mystery in one excavation trench. They discovered it by mapping absence across an entire region. By the end of the 13th century, communities that had occupied the northern San Juan country for generations were moving south and southeast. Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings, despite their masonry, springs, granaries, kivas, defensive possibilities, and generations of labor, were no longer enough to keep people there. By around 1300, the great occupation of the region had ended. But the people did not disappear. Pueblo communities farther south grew, and descendants of Mesa Verde's inhabitants live today among Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and the Rio Grande Pueblos. Migration, not extinction, is the correct ending. What archaeologists still cannot produce is a single departure scene. There is no surviving order saying everyone must leave on one date. Different households moved at different times. Some communities may have left gradually. Others, like Castle Rock, ended violently. Climate pressure mattered. Violence mattered. Social networks mattered. Religious and political change may have mattered. Archaeologists can reconstruct routes, settlement histories, architectural change, food stress, rainfall, and conflict. But the final choices belonged to individuals whose words were not written down. Imagine closing the entrance of a room your grandparents built, knowing you may never return. Imagine carrying what you can south while leaving grinding stones, masonry, roof beams, and the graves of ancestors behind. That is not a disappearance. It is a decision made under pressures we can measure only in fragments. And that may be the most unsettling truth about Mesa Verde. The ruins look frozen, but the society behind them was moving constantly. People changed where they lived, they engineered water systems, they built ceremonial spaces whose meanings archaeology cannot completely recover. They survived droughts, they gathered in plazas, they defended communities. Some experienced catastrophic violence. And finally, thousands participated in one of the great migrations in the history of the ancient Southwest. The stones make it tempting to imagine a lost civilization swallowed by mystery. But there was no vanished race here. They were families whose descendants are still alive. That actually makes the unanswered questions more powerful, because Mesa Verde is not a fantasy about people disappearing from history. It is evidence of people confronting conditions serious enough to make them abandon landscapes occupied by their ancestors for centuries. Cliff Palace is still under its sandstone arch. Square Tower House still rises 4 stories. The original plaster at Spruce Tree House still clings to walls. Water still seeps through the sandstone at Longhouse. Sun Temple still stands unfinished, or at least apparently unfinished, across from the canyon settlement it once faced. At Castle Rock, the evidence of violence remains documented in the archaeological record. These are living pieces of evidence, not legends. So when you look into Mesa Verde's cliffs, the real question is not, where did everybody go? We know they migrated, and we know their descendants endured. The harder question is this: what combination of drought, fear, conflict, belief, and necessity becomes powerful enough to make an entire region of communities decide that home is no longer survivable? If someone you know would spend an hour staring into that canyon asking the same question, share this video with them.